Hello everyone. Don't know why I'm actually wearing those. I don't need them today. Hello and welcome to yet another episode of God Loves Gays, an exploration into the history of Western thought, specifically Christianity, and how it has shaped our thoughts and feelings on gender and sex. Yesterday was a big old, kind of a broad dive into Roman history and the Roman Empire in the time of Jesus. Today is going to be a much deeper dive into Judaism in the time of Jesus, going back into the past, explaining some of the history, some of its origins, and what it was at the time of Jesus. We aren't going to be able to explore Judaism as much as I would love to, because it's a beautiful religion. It would take, its own, I could do a series of videos on Judaism as much as I could Christianity. But because Christianity is what we're exploring, we only get to spend maybe an episode or two on this topic. What we're going to cover today will include some of the Old Testament. We'll talk about that. Some of the cultural history, some language, a big kind of a broad view of what it is to be Jewish in that time period. Do remember that Judaism has changed since then, so not everything is going to be, one size fits all. And I am also not Jewish, so this is not my faith. I am not talking from a place of knowing this religion personally, which is why I think it is fitting that we have a Jewish voice open us up today. I need to come up with better ways to say things. A Jewish voice will introduce the religion today. Judaism from... it's a collection of Jewish texts that's edited by a Jewish author who also writes and explains a decent amount about it, Arthur Hertzberg. And we are just going to read the introduction because I thought it was a really lovely way to kind of open the stage on discussing Judaism. If I go to my marker. God made covenant with a particular people that it should be his priesthood. To this people, the seed of Abraham, the slaves he had just redeemed from Egypt, he revealed the Torah, the law which they were to obey, as the particular burden of the Jews and as a sign of their unique destiny in the world. He chose the land of Canaan as his inheritance, and that of his people, the Holy Land, which would forever remain the place in which he would most clearly be manifest. God exists in the world and cares for all men. For are not the children of Israel, as Amos said, no more to him than the Ethiopians? It was out of his love for mankind as a whole that he taught all men his way of redemption, the Torah, in his revelation in the desert of Sinai, to show that, like the desert, the law belongs to anyone who dares to claim it. God does not speak to man only in the Holy Land, for he addressed Noah in the land between rivers, Abraham in Ur, Moses in Midian, and he spoke even to Balaam, who came to curse the Jews in the desert of Sinai. The Talmud contains a vision of the end of days, in which the holiness that is particular to the land of Israel will spread out to encompass all the lands. Either of the two sets of assertions above is true as a description of Judaism, but neither is true without the other. It would be so easy to say these two versions of Judaism, the so-called universal and particular aspects, are in uneasy tension. This has indeed been said by non-Jewish commentators and polemicists for many centuries. From the perspective of one who stands inside the Jewish tradition, in the faith and experience of the Jewish believer, such a distinction does not exist. Jewish faith addresses itself not only to the Jews, it prescribes the law and the way of salvation for all mankind. Very lovely opening. What does Torah mean? We will get to that. So Judaism is a very ancient faith. I jumped right in and did not even say hello to everyone. Forgive me, folks. Hello, Natasha, Daniel, Lobsol, Marco, Billy, Mr. Cross, Alexis. Thanks for joining us. Judaism is an incredibly old religion, one of the oldest ones. We'll never really be, I think, certain how old because it was an oral tradition for a long time. Documents and old texts that we can trace back in history go back to at least like 1500, before Common Era, 2000. It's at least 2,000 or 3,000 years old. And the written works cover a couple thousand years of their history. Pieces of that history are actually reinforced in other texts from other cultures writing about those periods, like Egypt, Babylon. We can find references that match up with what the Jewish people are saying. So there's documentation that this faith has existed for a long time, that they've had these experiences with these other cultures, fighting and being enslaved and traveling and all these things. All of that is true. The faith itself is centered on the idea of the covenant, on this promise with God, which is what comes to mind for a lot of folks when thinking about this faith, the idea that the Jewish people are the chosen people, and how to interpret that. A lot of texts describe them as like the priesthood of humankind, that this is a special promise that you make with God to say, you know what, I'm going to hold myself to this higher standard to try and be even closer to God. It's not about if you're not the chosen people, if you're not in the faith, that you're not good or you're not with God. It's that you're trying to do more to be closer to God. That this is something that you take on as an extra challenge, which is why traditionally some texts talk about how converts were seen as very super awesome because they were willingly taking on that challenge, whereas Jewish people inherited the challenge as part of their traditions and their faith. It was a very moral religion, even going way back to its origins, which was very different compared to a lot of the religions that were around Judaism in that same time period. Let me get my image here. The rules that Jews had to follow had to do with a lot of different things, but many of them were moral, which was unique compared to, as we talked about yesterday, Greece and Rome. There's traditions in Mesopotamia and Egypt where faith in God didn't always necessitate being a good person. And often, even if that culture had, ideas of who a good person was, it wasn't considered part of the faith or religion. It was also, from pretty early on, a religion heavily based on the written word. They started writing things down and keeping written documents from as far back as, the kingdom of David and King Saul. Like, we have written documents that are that old, which again makes it different from a lot of religions at the time, where most cultures back then, not a lot was being written down, or what was being written down was documents, history, receipts, like things for business or government, but not necessarily religious texts. Not a lot of priests were going around writing down like the words of God, but Jewish people were. And they kept really intricate records about their religious traditions and the morals that went alongside with those traditions, the rules you were supposed to follow. And they, from the very beginnings, had this sense of it's important to study these things and understand them as part of being a good Jew. And so the idea of like book learning and studying and being someone that reads was a really big thing from early on. So in the old times, there was a much higher level of general literacy among Jewish people. One of the big things, which our friend Moses is holding there, are the commandments, the 10 commandments, which are sometimes called the Decalogue in, I think, Greek and English, or Mishwa in Judaism. Basically summarized as monotheism, one God, only one God. And remember, this is not no one can worship another God. It's the people who make this promise will only worship this God. Whereas they knew there were other ones, and they weren't that fond of them. But it wasn't an idea that it was more of a promise with that person. Not necessarily meaning that anybody else that doesn't worship this God is doomed. Obviously, the culture and the priests writing certain documents are going to prefer their own God, but it's not necessarily quite as demonized, I think, as it will be in Christianity. Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Keep the Sabbath, which means resting on Sundays. We will talk about that. Honor your parents. Don't kill. Don't cheat on your spouse. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. And don't covet someone else's goods, which are somewhat similar to no stealing, no adultery, but in the sense of manipulation, but in general, these are the big commandments. And I mention these specifically because gay sex isn't among them. just saying. Anyway, the covenant, the promise that God makes. There's actually like 4 of them that he makes with Abraham, Noah, Isaac, Moses. I almost didn't remember. Very bad of me. Something will happen to the people, or there's some kind of event that occurs. There's some kind of sin, punishment. God, has to punish them for what they've done, but offers mercy, forgiveness. As long as you do this, you will be, you'll be able to have this. There's this promise. As long as you obey my rules, you will have the promised land. As long as you are, good people, I won't flood the world again. A lot of different promises. 4 specific promises happen in the book, but there's a lot of other kind of thematic issues related to keeping the covenant. Where do Jewish people originate from? The language is kind of, if you trace it back, it's Ugaritic. It's basically the Middle East, where if you look at like where it's modern day, I think the connection between Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, that like valley there, which used to be Mesopotamia, and Israel, that's around where they came from. I don't know if they specifically came, I don't think they specifically came from Israel, because the whole Bible is about them conquering and then taking it over. So they traveled from somewhere else. They were originally a nomadic people, which really influences their rules and the laws they have to follow, and we will talk about why. There's a lot of suffering in Jewish history. Like, we're not even touching the 2000, more modern tragedies, but even back in biblical times, There were a lot of wars, there were exiles, there was being enslaved, like a lot of bad things happened. And so the Jewish people had to kind of confront the fact that they had this God, this promise with God. Why do bad things happen to us? And the explanation that often comes up in biblical literature is the idea that we've disappointed God, or we've not done something, we've not followed the rules good enough to be, keeping the promise. Obviously, we've failed somehow. The sense of guilt. Eventually, during the exile to Babylon, there was this sense that, like, why are we suffering so badly? How could we have sinned this bad? And that answer often was the idea that, well, maybe we're suffering for everyone's sins. Maybe that's our calling. In general, that question would often lead to the, well, we suffer because we've disappointed God, so we got to keep doing better. A major part of Jewish tradition, especially in the modern times, but not... are you not moving? There we go. I had to click back on my video. The synagogue. You've probably heard the term. Synagogues were originally developed during the exile in Babylon, which was a period where the Jewish people were, their land was conquered, and they were sent and exiled away and lived in mostly Babylon, Mesopotamian area. And the synagogues were developed as an answer to how to keep up Jewish tradition and faith at the time. It was like a school, a gathering place for people. Priests would come and teach. People would read together. It was a kind of a communal center that would eventually develop to be the heart of the tradition after the fall of the Second Temple. So in the time of Jesus, synagogues were a known thing, but they weren't the center part of the religion. That was the temple. Whereas once the temple falls, synagogues will take that place. So they don't quite have the same origin of like a church where the point of the church was to go and like worship and read the hymns. It was a place of learning, and there's a very heavy association between reading, learning, and religion in the Jewish faith. Broad overview of some of the laws that they have to follow, which is mentioned in the early books about how I've made this promise. I'm going to take care of you guys. I will be your God and watch out for you. Just obey these laws. Some of them were dietary, foods that they couldn't eat, which is called kashrut. Some of the things that were mentioned, anything that in water has fins and scales, you can eat it. If it doesn't have fins and scales, don't eat it. Don't eat the sinew of the hip, because that's where God touched Jacob. That's kind of a reference to a biblical story. Don't eat blood. Don't eat anything that dies of itself, which my interpretation was like, if it drops dead, maybe don't touch it. Of course, another famous thing is you can't work on the Sabbath. The idea being that God created the world, the universe, everything in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. And so when he gives Adam the world and basically makes this covenant with Adam and says, earth shall be yours to farm and take care of, only keep the Sabbath holy. You must rest every 6 days. And so that's why you could not, work on Sabbath. Let's see here. Yeah, we'll get to that. I forgot other laws. We'll cover this more tomorrow because we're going to compare Rome, Judaism, and Christianity and where they stand. But as far as laws and general rules go, Judaism does not like adultery, no abortion, no contraception, and no infanticide. Divorce was okay in the case of men, less acceptable for women, but polygamy was a normal thing at particular times of history. I don't remember if it was at this point. I think it was more historical than it was modern, but it wasn't really like looked down upon in Judaism as it was in Rome, where it was like, who would do that? They were not fond of homosexual acts, but we'll get to that. But they also weren't fond of masturbation, fellatio, sex with barren women, sex with menopausal women, sex with menstruating women. They also did not believe in incest. They had very specific rules about who you were allowed to marry as related to bloodlines. And public nudity was a no-no. Not a fan of public nudity, which was a big thing in Rome. They were all about it. They also had a concept as far as sinning and disobeying moral laws. There was also something, basically the purity laws, rules about ritual purity, or tahora, which isn't necessarily connected to sinning, but an idea of cleanliness, of purity, that had a lot to do in the early days with religious worship at the temple. We will talk about it in more detail when we get to Leviticus, but it was something that they also had to follow. Certain ideas about how clean you have to be to do certain things, which also set them apart from fellow Romans who did not have these rules. To the Romans, the Jews wouldn't eat normal things, they wouldn't have sex normally, they wouldn't bathe in public, they wouldn't work on Saturday. They had all these different rules that to Rome made them look so very strange. On one hand, sometimes it was like, oh, well, we kind of admire how weirdly determined you are. But a lot of the time it was a sense of, wow, those guys are really weird. And it definitely is part of what drove a wedge between Rome and the Jews, as opposed to, like, say, Greeks or Egyptians, where those cultures had a lot more in common and they fused together really easily. The Jews would not do that. They had nothing in common with the Romans, and from basically the moment that the Romans conquered their land, they were fighting. So, what are the actual Jewish texts? Which is the center of this faith that they're so heavily focused on reading and studying and keeping history, since their religious texts are a collection of their history. Well, the term for it is Tanakh. It is what Christians would call the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Now, in reality, of course, Old Testament sounds insulting, but also it's not the same text. When we talk about biblical translation and that stuff, we will actually discuss how the texts changed. But the Bible that Hebrew people use today is not the same Bible, is not the same thing as the Old Testament. It's not a one-to-one relationship. They're two versions of of a document that's existed in ancient history that got changed as various different groups used it. Tanakh is a acronym for 3 letters, the 3 different sections of their holy book, which I'll call the Hebrew Bible, just to kind of keep a unity between our various discussions of this. It was very common in Hebrew to have acronyms for things, partially because their written language at the time didn't have vowels. And so often when you were reading something, you just kind of had to know how to say it because there were no vowels there to tell you how to say it. So Tanakh, T-A-N-A-K-H, was an acronym for T-N-K, the 3 pieces of the Hebrew Bible. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Torah is the most famous and most important part. It's the 5 books of Moses, called the Pentateuch in Christianity and in English, which are historically said to have been written by Moses. Probably it was an oral tradition started by Moses, which was recorded and edited as history went on. We have proof it was edited. There's been arguments about whether or not Moses actually wrote it. I think the modern consensus is, yeah, there's some stuff in there that's old enough that it might go back to his time period. Probably it started as oral tradition that was eventually written and edited. Again, we'll talk about that another day. The Tanakh and the Torah is the first 5 books. Torah basically is often translated to law, but it's better translated as teaching. It is instruction, how to live, how to really understand the world and how to be a good person in it. The second section is Nevi'im, which is the prophets. This is a bunch of books that involve Jewish history once they've left Egypt and entered into the Promised Land and everything that happens there. There's a lot of wars, conquering, until eventually they establish their own nation. The last section is Ketuvim, which is less of a continuing narrative, the way that the first 2 pieces are. The last section is called the writings, and it has some kind of pieces that don't necessarily fit into a chronological order. The Proverbs, the Psalms, which are like holy hymns and poetry, Song of Songs, Book of, was it Daniel? Or there's a couple different books in there. Esther might be in there. Pieces that don't really fit with the other pieces. They tend to have a more poetic lean, some proverbs that are like short discussions of wisdom, and they're called the writings. all of those are various pieces that are in Christian traditions. But Christianity kind of cuts and pastes them, moves them around a little bit. Catholicism has extra ones that the Jewish people don't have. All of that is very complicated and will be discussed another day. But those are the general Hebrew texts that are considered canonical to them. But it's not all they study. They also have what's called the Talmud. Talmud is the overall term for writings about the Tanakh, about Jewish tradition, usually by rabbis. I think most of it's by rabbis, especially Midrash, where a rabbi will sit down and write an explanation or an interpretation of something from the Hebrew Bible. For instance, the Hebrew Bible says, don't work on the Sabbath. Okay. What does that mean? What constitutes work? When does the Sabbath start? When does the Sabbath end? It's more complicated than just don't work on the Sabbath. And so a lot of rabbis would come in and say, okay, well, here's how I interpret it based on this evidence from the book. And all of that writing had to be collected and kept together into the Talmud. There's also general rabbinic writings that I guess aren't collected in the old Talmuds, which are like thousands of years old, but are generally the same style. Again, they're writing about tradition and their interpretations. And these things are still going on today. This is a living thing. People still do this. For our purposes, we'll discuss one because it has to relate to the topic we're talking about. But in general, we're not going to be dealing with that kind of stuff since our topic is centered elsewhere. But it's just very fascinating that, again, it shows how much learning and writing and reading are such a major part of this religion, where there's an entire section dedicated on our priests are going to write and explain their thoughts on the tradition. Like, sure, Christians have some, idea of that, but not in the same way. Like, we have old famous Christian authors and writers that most Christians have never heard about and have probably never read the work of, and they'd never be discussed in church. Like, they'd rarely be mentioned. It's not the same thing, whereas Talmud is considered like a part of religious tradition and something that would probably be referenced and talked about at times. Alrighty. Let's see, those are folks talking about the books and words. Let's get to our discussion of what's actually in these books. Since we're not going to go into deep dive into what these books mean, since when we talk about them, we're going to talk about what Christians think about them. But we're going to talk about what exists. What were these books, which then Christianity would take and go to somewhere else with. The first section, Torah, is so incredibly important. It's like studying Torah was a major part of religious activity in Judaism. You pray, you study the Torah, you go to synagogue, you follow the law. It is a history of Judaism that starts with the creation of the world by God, the origin of mankind, specifically the Jewish people, the journey into Egypt where they are enslaved. Moses brings them out of Egypt, and then they go to the Promised Land, which is where Moses dies. Moses dies, and that's the end of the Torah. It's historically, as I said, been said that Moses wrote the Torah. Well, the last 8 sections are actually supposed to have been written by Joshua, because they're about Moses when he's dead, which means he couldn't have written them. More than likely, based on studies of these texts, there were at least 4 sources, or at least 4 styles of writing that define the text. But it is really, really old. It was just edited as time went on, which makes sense if you think about this as a culture taking its writings with it. They're building this big library of writing as they go, which is being edited and copied and turned around as you go on. Now, Judaism started as a nomadic people, which meant they weren't living in towns and cities. They were wanderers, traveling with their herds and their animals, looking for food, living in a pretty desert, rough land. I mean, think about where they are. Mesopotamia is the Middle East. There's plant life and wildlife and all, but not a lot. The major sections that have a lot of life, Egypt along the Nile and the Mesopotamian area, are going to be conquered really fast. And you're going to have the Egyptian kingdom, which, because of the desert that it lives in, has natural defenses. And for the most part, Egypt is untouched until, say, the Romans. Mesopotamia is a valley between two rivers that's going to be taken over by various city-states that are always just fighting each other. Assyria, Babylon, Sumeria, like all these different countries or city-states fighting each other. The Jewish people are stuck between them, between these two really fertile lands that are either, protected by desert or fighting all the time. So they don't have a fertile land of their own. The land that they live along and travel along is pretty mountainous. It's also a road right between, Egypt, road, Mesopotamia. So there's not a lot of safe protections when you're on that road in the middle there, trying not to get conquered or what have you. They spend a lot of time traveling, being conquered, being enslaved, until eventually they try to develop, their own nation state, which is what the Torah describes God promising them this nation state to come. All right. The first section, Torah, has 5 books, which in English would be called Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Bereshit is the first one in Judaism. Shemot, Vayikra, Bemidbar, and Devarim. I practiced these this morning. In Judaism, you'd name the books based on the first few words that were in the title. So in the beginning becomes Bereshit. Bereshit. That's how it is. That's the creation of the world, creation of man, the stories of ancient history. These are myths in the very first section. Exodus is more probably real history, where it describes how the Jews were enslaved and how they eventually escape and leave. Leviticus takes a whole different turn. It's basically just rules of conduct. Holiness codes is part of it. What you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, how to keep clean, that kind of thing. Numbers, or I have trouble with this one. Bemidbar is the journey from Egypt, which they've escaped, up to the Promised Land, and it takes 40 some years to get there, and all the troubles that happen. The very last section, Devarim, or Deuteronomy, is another kind of coverage of the events. It's presented as a speech by Moses at the end of his life, where they are not in the Promised Land yet, but they're coming up on it. Moses dies before they ever get to the Promised Land, unfortunately, and that's where the Torah ends. The next section, which we call Nevi'im, or prophets, is not organized like this in Christian tradition, but the prophets and the judges are sections of Christian tradition. Once they get to the Promised Land, it's not empty. People live there. So unfortunately, that's when the wars and the conquering start, which you think back then, that was happening all the time. And this was a people that had been wandering for years and struggling under all these other nations who said, enough's enough, we're going to get one of those. And of course, this section is going to be incredibly skewed, as the documents of a conquering people always will be, writing about their enemies. It's also going to mention a lot of other ancient places. They call it the land of Canaan that they are conquering. They're fighting the Canaanites. There's also mentions of various groups who are smaller countries or clans nearby, like the Moabites, Ammonites. There's fighting going on. There's, basically a lot of struggle that's centered around a figure will rise as a prophet, someone that God chose to lead us, and they will lead us, and then that person will die, or something will happen, the story will move on, and the people will need a new leader, and a new prophet will rise up. Judaism just divides them into the former, the latter, and the 12 minor prophets. And they are arranged in a I believe, chronological order, where certain characters that, or certain people that would be considered prophets may not be in this section, or would be here, but they are more like writings. There's a different reason for them. They're not being told for historical purpose, so they're put somewhere else, even though they're a prophet. And as I said, the Ketuvim, the writings, contain more poetic books. Song of Songs is really famous. It's the porniest thing in the Bible, where it discusses love and sexuality in a very poetic way. The book of Job is very famous. That's the story of God punishing a man just because, but it's here because it is a writing, an exploration of morality and the wisdom of God. Like, all these are kind of more philosophical explorations than most of the other books that are like histories of things that happened. There's obviously going to be some philosophy and morality thrown throughout, but these are more like, we're going to sit down and explore some deep stuff, not necessarily history. So even though some figures in there would be probably called prophets, Christianity would consider Daniel a prophet, I believe, but not Judaism. Yeah. So that's how they organize it, which is, as we'll see another day, completely different from how Christianity organizes it. Now, we have an image of a tradition that is very, very old, comes from people wandering in the desert who finally managed to create a country of their own. In prophets, in the Nevi'im, they eventually do create a country. There's 3 kings. They exist for a bit until, unfortunately, Babylon conquers them. And then there are no kings for a while. And then, unfortunately, Romans are going to come along. And we are at the time of the Romans occupying this nation. It's still a Jewish country. They haven't been exiled the way that they have in some other times, but they are being controlled by the Romans. Like we discussed yesterday, Rome had conquered half of Europe and was basically, they take taxes, they take a lot of the food, they control what you do, you have to honor the emperor, various things that you have to do. Jews were given some leeway on like worshiping the emperor, entering the military, what have you, but it wasn't enough leeway for them because there's just so much that doesn't mesh between Rome and Judaism. And you'll see a lot of issues where, unfortunately, it would come to a head in really violent ways. One historian talks about a issue where a Roman man exposed himself in public, thinking he was funny because they had no issue with public nudity, and I'm sure he didn't respect these people. And there was a riot that killed something like 20,000 people. This was not a happy time. The Jewish people were incredibly divided in terms of wealth. There were the upper class who were doing pretty well for themselves, many of whom were getting on just fine with the Romans because the Romans had money and power and they were happy to share it with anybody that helped them keep their rule. So you'd see issues where Jewish priests were trying to get the Jewish people to accept more pagan things, trying to introduce more pagan traditions, and the Jewish people pushing back. Corruption among the higher class was leading to a lot of discontent and upset among the general Jewish populace, most of whom were poor. At this point, Jewish people were spread throughout all the places of the empire. I mean, they were not just in Israel, even though that was their home nation. They lived in a very kind of clannish lifestyle where you knew who the Jewish people were in town and the community because they lived together. Their laws required so many strict observances, it was hard to do among the pagans. Like, how do you stick to your strict dietary rules, strict clothing rules, strict working rules without all of you being there together? And so it set them apart from everyone and made them, easy targets of ostracization and judgment and issues like that. There were struggles where Judaism would see issues with the fact that in certain places and at certain times, they were losing people to pagan traditions because there was this sense of, to succeed and survive in the Roman world, you have to accept a certain amount of paganism. How much is too much before you don't consider yourself Jewish anymore? And a lot of issues with that, especially in Israel itself. There's a lot of rules that the pagans kind of respected but didn't understand, like the very strict moral rules. Then there's ones that they thought were just completely perverse, like circumcision. They did not understand circumcision. They didn't understand polygamy, which they thought was really weird, and which the Jewish forefathers, like, ancient figures in the Bible, were polygamists. Why? They're an ancient nomadic people. We're going to talk about that as we're getting to Jewish sexuality here. All the various rules that controlled who they married, who they had sex with, and how they did it, were very much based on the fact that probably they were nomads trying to survive in a very, very harsh lifestyle. And the more babies you have, the more likely it is that someone will live. Someone might make it. If you think about the rules that are forbidden as far as sexuality goes, fellatio, masturbation, things that you couldn't do were based on the idea that these are sex acts that won't lead to kids. And we need kids. We need them now. Everybody's dying. Male homosexual acts are specifically mentioned and forbidden in Leviticus, but not female acts. Why? Because it's only male homosexuality that is a waste of the possibility for children. A lot of authors and scholars have pointed out that interpretations of that section seem to imply it only forbids anal intercourse, which would be, saying, well, that's no baby's gonna pop out of there, and come on, we need some babies. It would also explain why they were against abortion, infanticide, contraception, all things that were normal to the Romans. There is other things that people think that the Leviticus section, which we'll dive deep into, could have been forbidding, rather than just general homosexuality or anal sex. Might have related to pederasty, which was a known thing in Rome, but that would imply that the rule was written then. We'll have to look at the text and see when it was written. Maybe it was only referring to anal sex. Maybe it was only saying that you can't have sex with men, but you can love them. It doesn't. You have to remember that this is a era that doesn't necessarily have an association between certain things where a homosexual lifestyle was to be forbidden. It is specifically saying don't lie with men as you do with women. Very, very vague. Doesn't seem to imply in general a sense of a homosexual person. Another reason people think it might have been forbidden were the purity laws, which is perfect to talk about right here. Purity laws have to do with, in the ancient world, what was permissible when you went to visit temple. Judaism is a very clean religion. It's actually one of the reasons why fewer Jews died in the Black Plague, because they have traditions that keep you clean. Wash your hands before you eat. They were doing it 2,000 years ago. There were certain things related to birth. A certain number of weeks before the mother that just gave birth was considered clean. Menstruation's a famous one that says don't touch things that someone's menstruating is touching or you're impure. But a thing that kind of gets confused in the purity discussions is most people don't really understand what they are, and Christians immediately associate impurity with sin. That's not what it is. In the ancient times, it was the idea that you had to be a certain level of cleanliness to attend temple or to be a priest. So there's this association with God and the presence of God that requires a certain amount of purity. Eventually, as we'll see when we get down to the text, the purity laws were extended when access to the temple was no longer available. And so there was this sense of, well, how do we keep our Jewishness and our traditions if we're not, doing purity laws for the temple or what have you? And so some of those laws were possibly spread to further than just temple. But when it was just going to temple, you have to be pure. Well, that means, most people understand there's only one temple in Israel in the olden world. The one temple is the temple in Jerusalem, and that's where God lives. It's not like Christianity where everybody goes to church and there's a church in every town. There's a synagogue around, but that's a place of teaching and learning and studying, not necessarily where God lives. And so for a lot of people, if they weren't going to temple all the time, if they lived outside of Jerusalem, like how much did these purity laws really affect them? And if that's what the Leviticus law is, a law on purity, then it doesn't matter to them. If you're only not allowed to have anal sex because you're going to go to temple, then that doesn't matter. Possibly why that would be related to purity is excrement and semen were both considered kind of unclean to a certain extent. So combining the two of them might have been like, well, don't do that. That's dirty. I mean, they're not wrong. Be safe, guys. Safe sex. Let's see. So, speaking of things in the Bible that are referred to as impure, toeba is the Hebrew term that's often translated as abomination in the Bible, used for specific sexual acts, sometimes in reference to generally kind of context-wise homosexuality. It's also used to refer to pagan acts. It refers to ritual impure, something that is impure rather than something that's like sinful or immoral. So again, the context here kind of seems to imply that this was about being clean, not about being immoral. So now we get to a few old world discussions that actually reference what we're here to talk about. The sexual world of the ancient Jews. Now, you're going to find that as much as there was a lot of reading and learning back then, a lot of what was being written down is religious texts being written by religious people. The scribes, the scholars, the rabbis. Or, well, I don't know that they would be called rabbis at that point. We'll get to that. They were all going to be from the viewpoint of a man in the priest system. So, obviously, being someone in that system, they're going to reinforce the rules that are listed in the Bible, listed for the priests. So, often when you find ancient Jewish writings about these things, it's to condemn them as inappropriate. Pseudo-Phokilides was a Greek text written by a Jew that described proper home behavior. It said that intercourse between men was a transgression of nature not found in the animal world. Again, we got that animal world defense. It says not to let women imitate the sexual role of men. That kind of sounds like a Roman thought there, doesn't it? Talk about imitate men, meaning don't let women penetrate women. Don't let your sons have long hair, as it is for voluptuous women. And you must be careful to protect beautiful boys from male advances and virgins until their wedding day. Another rabbi commentary on Leviticus, the famous text about homosexuality, is Sifra, and it describes homosexuality as an Egyptian and a Canaanite practice. Again, associating, oh, the homos, those are those people, not us. We don't have homos, they have homos. Everybody's pointing at everybody else, like Rome's like, no, it's them, and Jews are like, no, it's them, you know. The Talmud has a really interesting discussion. Remember, the Talmud is the rabbinic discussion of how to interpret the laws. There's a discussion about the priesthood, where priests have to marry people of a specific level of purity, virgins. And so there's a discussion where one priest was like, well, if a woman has sex with another woman, if they're rubbing on each other, are they allowed to marry priests? Are they considered virgins still? And there were two schools of thought that were like, well, no, she's had sex, so that doesn't count. She's been rubbing. And another was like, well, no, there was no penetration, so I guess she could still marry a priest. And there was kind of this historical discussion about, well, is it okay if lesbians marry priests? Which is really fascinating. There's this kind of, you get this sense as you look at these old texts that it's clear homosexuality existed. It was known and it was practiced. There were terms for it, there were rules for it, there were priests talking about it. Did that mean it was evil or punished or opposed? Not necessarily. Now you say, oh, wait, those rules. One, there's a lot of vagueness around the rule as to what it necessarily forbids and why it forbids it. We'll never be able to really know for sure exactly what was intended when those words were written down, what those words originally meant. I mean, as man lies with woman is really, really vague. We also have this idea, based on how Leviticus was written, that kind of implies that it was added later. I'll read it and I'll discuss that. And not to mention, in addition, there's this sense that if we look at the historical documents and these discussions of what's appropriate or not, and the idea that a certain section that says, we'll stone them to death, there's no document ever discussing such a thing occurring. Nothing. You'd think such a big thing as, oh, well, we found, we're going to stone these gays to death would be written down, and it's not. And part of the reason for that is likely because proving such a thing would have been really difficult. You had to have at least like 2 witnesses. You had to catch them in the act. And then you had to drag them in front of the Sanhedrin, which were the temple kind of priest community, like, what do you call that? Like the group of priests that ruled everybody. You had to bring them into the Sanhedrin and say, hey, we got like 3 witnesses that saw them doing the nasty. And then the Sanhedrin has to kind of judge it and agree and go, all right, I guess we'll kill them. And then they kill them. It takes all that. It takes a lot. On top of which, when the temple goes down, the Sanhedrin goes away. There's no more priestly judges to judge everybody. So after the year 70, up to now, who's stoning people? There's no one to judge it. Because remember, these Jewish laws are not influenced, they're not put into place by the government. Israel was one thing, but Israel falls. Once Israel falls, there's no government that's going to go around stoning the gay people. You know what I mean. So it's very likely that it was not socially acceptable. It wasn't necessarily the norm. Were people being really heavily punished for it? Probably not. And it probably was something going on because there's so many mentions of it in other texts where they're like, well, how do we handle these lesbians? What do we do with these gay guys? They existed, and they weren't necessarily approved of, probably as a holdover from the fact that in the ancient world, they needed as many babies as possible. Being homosexual wasn't adding to the baby count, but it probably wasn't a huge thing in that era, especially after the fall of the temple when there's no judging ability there. Now, before we actually get to our readings and discussions, let's mention the gender identity. Let's look at our... Oh, I wanted to show y'all. Those are all the various peoples. I should have mentioned those when I was talking about the various people. We're going to go into far more detail about the actual Bible and the people that are in it when we discuss the specific sections, but we'll have to get to that eventually. Why did they assume everyone in Israel was white? They don't. They just, people are very good at ignoring things that don't match their worldview. It's dumb. And also artwork just portraying it the other way. That's the temple. So, we'll mention here, I've mentioned a couple times, big temple gets destroyed. In Judaism, there was this idea that God lived in the temple, or in the tabernacle, which was what they carried with them in the desert. This sense of a specific place that God lives in on earth. And that was, they built a temple to hold that during King David, King Solomon. King Solomon built it way, way back when. It was destroyed or very heavily damaged before the exile, but then like 70 years later, they got to come back and they rebuilt it. That is the second temple. That's a recreation of what it would look like. Unfortunately, when the things come to a head during the times, a couple decades after Jesus dies, and the Romans destroy it. The Romans destroy everything. We will not discuss that today because it's a major aspect of how Christianity developed. That'll be tomorrow, but unfortunately, that had a huge influence on Judaism because up till that point, there was this sense of there being a real physical place on earth where God is. Well, now it's gone. Where is God? And they had to really reimagine and redevelop a lot of their faith, which was done by a group called the Pharisees, who are mentioned in the Bible in really negative ways. Another topic. They were the people that kind of brought everything together. They canonized the books. They developed the system of rabbis, where you have these teachers who keep the history and teach it and share it, and the synagogues where everybody gathers together in the community and learns together. That stuff wasn't really the centerpiece of Jewish tradition until the temple fell and they had to do something new. That's what is going on there with the temple. But for now, let's talk about gender identity. Historical Judaism recognizes 6 genders. There are men and there are women. And there are saris, who are naturally or unnaturally people who were born as men who cannot have birth, Jesus, cannot conceive, or they don't fully develop in puberty. For some reason or another, they are not normal men, maybe castrated, they can't conceive, and so they are considered saris, which is basically kind of male to female, like not necessarily depending on how they lived their lives and saw themselves, but kind of an equivalent of our idea of a MTF transgender person. Ionlet is the opposite, an infertile woman or person who was born as a woman who didn't go through puberty, a barren like they are male to female. There's that's a person that's born a woman who cannot conceive or their genitals don't quite match up. Tumtum, are the word meaning hidden, refers to a sex and genital that is unknown, in a state of hiding. And that doesn't just mean like gender ambiguity. It means that literally there is skin covering their genitals, like maybe it didn't grow in fully. We're not entirely sure in the modern world what the equivalent is, but it's some kind of intersex gender. And multiple texts in the ancient world refer to this gender. Specifically, this image here is of Abraham and Sarah, who in certain texts in Jewish tradition, in the Talmud, are considered to be tumtum, because the story in Abraham and Sarah is that neither of them can conceive, and then the angels come and God blesses them, and they're able to have children, and Isaac is born. I don't know why I said Isaac, so weird. Isaac. Androgynos is another one. That is people that had outward genitals of both genders. So someone that developed multiple genital styles, I guess. Another version of intersex, where, you know, tumtum is more, there's something hidden about the genitals, they didn't grow out fully, you know, something to that extent. Androgynous is probably more like they have breasts and penis, something like that. History says that in a text called the Genesis Rabbah, I believe it is, 8:1, which I will actually open up here and read. It is a commentary on Genesis and the story of Adam, saying that Adam was an androgynous created by God, and that only the male and female genders were created when God separated Adam into Adam and Eve. The confusion here a little bit is because the word Adam is not a man's name. Adama is earth in Hebrew, and God made people from Adama, from earth. And the term Adam is used to refer to humanity as a whole. So when he created humanity, Adam was an androgynous being who was then separated into a man named Adam and a woman named Eve. That's one interpretation, which a Hebrew rabbi describes here in the Bereshit Rabbah number 8. Said Rabbi Yirmiyah ben Elazar, I apologize if I'm butchering these names, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created him as an androgynon, or androgynos, as it is said, male and female he created them. Said Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, in the hour when the Holy One created the first human, he created for him a double face, and sewed him and made him backs, a back here and back there, as it is said. They objected to him. It says, he took one of his ribs, he said to them, it means one of his sides, just as you'd say for this one side of the tabernacle. Basically saying that when God took one of the ribs, what he actually did was take one of the genders and separate them out. Very interesting interpretation. It's somewhat difficult to follow along and read, since these interpretations are full of also, like, they're like conversational. They're kind of, I think, like somebody writing down people discussing this in the synagogue, and it references a lot of names and a lot of Hebrew, but it's really neat to look at and read through. Let's see here. More mentions of this, these kind of people. In the Talmud, there's a reference to an androgynous who presents both male and female physical traits is in some ways like men and in some ways like women. In some ways, they are like both men and women, and in other ways, like neither men nor women. Depending on the outer appearance, it often decided whether legally they were considered female, male, neither, or both. They were generally considered to be a new identity, where unfortunately that meant, in terms of Judaism, the laws that applied to men and women applied both to the androgynous, in cases where they seem to be very much in the middle of both, rather than living as a woman or living as a man, which meant that anything that, like, restricted, any restrictions or what have you, applied doubly to you, which is unfortunate, but that it's really neat that, like, look at that. 2,000 years ago, they had an idea of all these varying genders and realities of how to be a person, very heavily based on whether or not you could have kids, because that was so important to early Judaism's survival out in the nomads in the wandering lands. All right, let's scroll down here. Now, we're going to do, I dropped it, we're going to read 3 things from the Old Testament. Because for the most part, when we study this stuff, we're going to talk about it in a Christian context. But I couldn't not read a few things and discuss them, since they're just super mega awesome and or important. We'll mostly be focusing on the New Testament, but we got to talk about Leviticus. Because, we all know, what do people quote when they talk about God doesn't like those people? I think I skipped my... Oh no, I'm on the right image. Okay. I put in markers so I would know when I need to change the images this time, and I'm still not remembering. They always quote Leviticus whenever they want to say God don't like those gays. So, what is Leviticus? Let's read. Leviticus 18, Sexual Relations. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt, where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I am bringing you. You shall not follow their statutes. My ordinances you shall observe, and my statutes you shall keep, following them. I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my statutes and my ordinances. By doing so, one shall live. I am the Lord. None of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. I am the Lord. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or born abroad. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your son's daughter or of your daughter's daughter, for their nakedness is your own nakedness. I've never said the word nakedness so much. That's also more than likely a euphemism for genitals. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, begotten by your father, since she is your sister. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister, she is your father's flesh. This is sounding funny to read aloud, jeez. Where is the part about... there it is. Okay, I will skip past all the nakednesses. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her menstrual uncleanliness. I mentioned that earlier. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her. You shall not give any of your offspring to sacrifice them to Moloch, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a man as with a woman. It is an abomination. Mentioned earlier, the word abomination that's used here, toeba, refers to ritual purity. And notice that it's mentioned right after a mention of a pagan god. You will not sacrifice children to Moloch, and you won't have sex with men as with women, which is one of the reasons why people think maybe this was related to sacred prostitutes. You don't sacrifice to those gods, and you don't have sex for those gods. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself with it, nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. Another thing that probably happened during some of those more wild pagan parties. Again, it definitely feels very like surrounded by these ideas of paganism and what's going on there more than it does the other stuff earlier where it was like very specific about the nature of incest. You shall not uncover the nakedness. Why would it not in those sections say, you shall not uncover the nakedness of a man as you would a woman? That's about, like, why wouldn't they include it there if it's a sexual sin, instead putting it with the thing about Moloch? Now, there's even more to make this interesting. This section is called Torah Kohanim, the Priest's Manual. Priest's Manual. Priest. They cover in a lot of detail the laws that priests of Judaism have to follow. Sections 8 through 10, 16, 1 through 21, or 28, 21, and 22. All are specifically for priests. Now, some sections don't just cover things that priests have to do. What we just read was not just for priests. It was for everybody. That was section 18. There are very obvious changes in the text as you get through it, 18 being towards the end, that make it seem like multiple people wrote the texts. All of them were priests. You can tell when a priest is writing in the Bible. There's a very obvious tone, language choice that makes it very obvious. This is someone from the priest class talking about this stuff. The thing that makes this seem different is it's like there's two groups of priests here, because the first 1 through 16 deal with what is a priest going to do? What do you do when you're at the temple? What's appropriate for that stuff? Those, I talked about how in the ancient times when they had the temple and they had the priests that stayed at the temple, there were very strict purity laws about what you could do with the temple or how you had to be to get to go to temple or to marry a priest, very specific rules about how clean you had to be. Not sin. Sin is not the same as being impure. You don't sin when you're on your period, but you're not clean. It's a different thing. Now, around 17 and 18, the shift changes to discussions in general of what people should do to be pure. There's this association that it is not clean to do this, it is not appropriate to do this, in a far more general sense. And if you look at the timelines, it seems as if the later sections were added to the first section and edited in when the people were exiled, that first time in Babylon. When Babylon conquered the Israel location. Geez, I'm losing words. They conquered, and they kicked everybody out. That was their thing. They would take over an area, and they'd kick the people out. And so the Jewish people were exiled once again, and forced to kind of, figure out what they were going to do at that point. And so the priests start writing well, if we can't go to temple and we can't, how do we keep our Jewishness? How do we keep following the rules? Obviously, they've got to apply to everywhere, to us, to the land. And so there's this switch from purity and certain behaviors that you only do at temple to, let's do this all the time. It's entirely possible that some of these more later additions that involved stricter rules about sex have to do with this switch to, now we've got to kind of codify how to behave as people now that we don't have our homeland and our temple doing it for us. Basically what that tells me is when they were living in Israel with the kings of David and Solomon and what have you, Leviticus 18 did not exist. It was added much later, 500 BCE. Interesting, isn't it? Basically, it's so confusing. It's ancient. It is written in a context so far removed from us that even Jewish folks that have inherited these texts, the oldest complete Jewish text is from the year 1000 in the Common Era. We don't have texts that go that far back, and the language itself has changed. There's a lot of issues to trying to interpret this section and really make sense of it in a modern sense. We'll get into a lot more about how the texts can become corrupted and changed over time, but it's just impossible 3,000 some years later to look at this and say, obviously this is God saying morally it is wrong to have homosexual relationships. It's just, there's too much gray to it. It just doesn't make sense. There's too much to interpret. It doesn't stand up. There are far more obvious things that happen later where somebody's going to be no, really, bad, and we'll discuss those. But this is the one and only time where a law is presented as this is something that we have to follow. These laws were given to us by God. You have to follow them. And that's the only time really that the Bible really comes down on homosexuality and is in Leviticus. And it's just too old. It's too obscure. It's too vague. I do not take this as proof. Don't. You shouldn't. it's not. It's all we had to say about Leviticus. But we're not done with reading. Oh no. Because we still have to talk about queer interpretations of the Bible, which are popular, and there's two of them, and they're both from the Old Testament. Old Testament. They're both from the Hebrew Bible. The first and the shortest is Ruth, the story of Ruth. You may have heard of Ruth and Naomi. It is a biblical story set in, I believe, it's right after Judges, so it's in the Prophets. During the time when there's a lot of war going on and things are not quite that easy, there's not really a nation yet, but where there's this like historical narrative of how the nation is being born, the story is interrupted by this much smaller story of a family that really doesn't have anything to do with like the line of kings or prophets or what have you. It's just a young woman down on her luck. Naomi is the mother-in-law. Ruth is the daughter-in-law. And the two of them, through bad luck, are going to end up being in a lot of danger, because we haven't talked a lot about it, but in Jewish tradition, your social status is tied to your male sons, and your lineage goes through men. So women were very vulnerable if they didn't have male family members. And so this is going to be a story of two women who team up and end up taking care of each other and figuring things out and helping one another. There's nothing really in the text to support the idea that they were romantically together, but there's so much love and affection there that feminists, lesbians, like they've kind of they've been inheriting this story and kind of taking it as a story of female love, whatever kind of love you want that to be. It also explores issues of nationality, because the main character, Ruth, is a Moabite, which is an enemy nation of Israel that's mentioned throughout the books in really negative ways, but Ruth is our hero. And it's likely this was written during a time where the authors were trying to promote intermarriage and the idea that you don't have to be born Jewish to be Jewish, because that's what happens here. Let's read Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she'd heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. Meaning that things are better back home, the famine is over. So she set out from the place where she'd been living, and she and her 2 daughter-in-laws, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you, or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me and more as well, if even death parts me from you. When Naomi saw she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me." Her name, Naomi, means pleasant, and she changes it and says, "I'll be Mara," because Mara means bitter, referring to how badly things have gone for her. She's trying to have the daughters-in-law go back home because they're still young. They could return to their families and remarry and have lives. Naomi's old now. Now that she doesn't have any sons or husbands, she's basically kind of doomed. Now, Jewish culture was very good about taking care of the needy and the poor in their community, but she still didn't have a family to take care of her. Ruth refuses to give her up. So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. So Naomi's very old. They need to eat. Ruth says, "I'm going to go to the fields and I'm going to get some food. Maybe a hot guy will see me and I'll get, I'll have some, luck." So that's what she's doing. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant, who was in charge of the reapers, "To who does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She's the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servants, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of the bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves. Do not reproach her. You must also pull some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." So he is really helping her out, letting her get some extra food, making her job easier. He recognizes she's in a tough spot and has gone out of her way to help Naomi when she didn't have to, so he's helping her in turn. A big major part of this story, the idea that, good rewards good, and being kind to one another is a good thing, even if you are a foreigner. Alright, we're going to skip some sections here. It's not much longer. I'm going to read the, let's see. Yes, this section here. So, who is Boaz and why does he matter? In Jewish tradition, there's this idea, there's this law of the Levirate. Again, your male family line is super important. Your lineage is very important. It's important to have kids. If a woman, if her husband dies and she has no male heirs, legally, she can ask the brother of her husband, who does not have a wife, to marry her, or to at least give her male heirs. This comes up a couple times in the Bible. It has to do with the fact that, she needs a child to continue the family line, and it has to be a member of the family, so a male member of the family should help her out, either marry her or at least give her a son. Now, when it keeps mentioning Boaz is related to Naomi's husband because that would apply the law of Levirate to him. A unique thing in this story is Ruth is not a Jew by birth. She is a Moabite. Technically, the law shouldn't apply to her. But Naomi and Boaz are both going to go out of their way to help her. Naomi's the one that gets the idea and says, hey, he's a distant kind of cousin. The law says he's got to, take care of us, help out. And so she tells her, go to Boaz in the middle of the night and uncover his feet and euphemisms for have sex with him, talk to him about getting married. And Boaz is like kind of touched by this because he is an older man at this point. She could have had somebody younger and prettier, and he's like, you know what? You're nice. Let's do this, but we've got to kind of be smart about it because there's another man that could technically apply for this law of the Levirate, closer relation. People might, not agree with what's going on. They might not want it to happen. So what he does is the next morning he goes to the council in public and says, hey, so, you heard Naomi's back. Well, they got this land they're trying to sell. Anybody want to make the money off this land, what have you? And the kinsman says, hey, I'm a kinsman. I should, hey. And Boaz is like, well, are you going to marry, Ruth? You get that money, you can marry Ruth. And he goes, oh, no, wait, I don't want that. I would rather not deal with all that. And Boaz says, okay, then there's nobody in my way to marry her, and that's what we're doing. And they do. And that means that Ruth now has safety in the community. She's got her husband. Her social place is secured. Naomi, as the mother-in-law, is now also protected. And now they have a possibility of a future and a son, which immediately, the very last section says, Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Happy ending. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him. She approaches Naomi and says, bless you for taking care of me. I'm going to have a son, and in your old age, he'll take care of you, because I love you, and you love me. Like, oh man, these two really, really loved each other. Whether or not it's romantic or not, lots of folks have taken it as a kind of a story that focuses heavily on the really passionate love between women, whatever that kind of love may be. This next story is not as ambiguous. That story, I think, is more of an interpretation of a story that deals with female love, which is lovely. Not necessarily a kind of a possible historical evidence of love. This is the story of David and Jonathan. David being most infamous for the whole Goliath thing, the guy that killed the big guy. He's an incredibly famous and important figure in Jewish history. I mean, Jesus is referred to as the son of David, the descendant of David, because David's part of the line of kings in Judaism and was one of the kings of Israel. He didn't start that way. He caught the eye of the king at the time, Saul, because he killed the Goliath. And Saul was like, hey, you are pretty cool, mister. Why don't you marry my daughter? You're now a national hero because you killed this bad guy. Marry my daughter. Unfortunately, for poor David, it's not long before Saul starts to get suspicious and judgmental because, well, now I've married him to my daughter. He's popular with the people. What if he tries to take the throne from my family and from my son? Well, unfortunately for Saul, Jonathan, his son, is in love with David. Literally. Let's read this section here where David has just killed the Goliath. Saul recognized his miraculous feat and was like, hey, cool, buddy. And Jonathan, Saul's son, walks up. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Jonathan stripped himself of his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, and his armor, and even his sword and his bow and his belt. David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. As a result, Saul set him over the army, and all the people, even the servants of Saul, approved. So, David succeeds in defeating the Goliath. He gets famous. The king rewards him. He meets the king's son, Jonathan, and it's love at first sight. Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And the word used is love, the same kind of love that's often used to describe wives and husbands. In smaller terms, there's also some other places it's used to refer to parents and children, but it's always very, very passionate and strong. Unfortunately, as I said, King Saul is going to get suspicious and not trust David, but Jonathan's loyalty is to David. Saul spoke with his son Jonathan and all his servants about killing David. But Saul's son Jonathan took great delight in David. Jonathan told David, "My father Saul is trying to kill you. Therefore be on guard tomorrow morning. Stay in a secret place and hide yourself. I will go out and stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I'll speak to my father about you. If I learn anything, I will tell you." Immediately he's like, that's my man. Sadly, Saul is not going to be changed. He is not going to change his mind. At this point, Saul is just really, really certain that David is dangerous. Maybe because he sees his son is totally head over heels. And unfortunately for him, his daughter, Michal, I think it is, also likes David, and they help David to escape the father. And David and Jonathan have one last kind of meeting as David is fleeing. He came before Jonathan and said, "What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin against your father, that he is trying to take my life?" He said to him, "Far from it. You shall not die. My father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? Never." But David also swore, "Your father knows well that you like me, and he thinks, 'Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be aggrieved.' But truly, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, there is but a step between me and death." Then Jonathan said to David, "Wherever you say, I will do for you." Let's see where we go here. They discuss their plan and what they're going to do. He goes and meets with his dad again and tells him, "Hey, stop trying to kill my friend." Aww. That's very sweet. I'm glad to help, Katie. That's what I want to do with this, you know. Our religions are ours, and nobody can take them. And they were always gay. Just wait. So, he goes back to his dad. Saul is not happy. He's like, "You, the son of a perverse, rebellious woman, you have chosen the son of Jesse to your own shame." You know, very, very upset. Then he returns and speaks to David one more time. They say goodbye, and it's read like this. As soon as the boy had gone, David rose from beside the stone heap and prostrated himself with his face on the ground before Jonathan. He bowed 3 times, and they kissed each other and wept with each other. David wept the more. Then Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, since both of us have sworn in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever.'" They part. Unfortunately, things escalate. There is a war and a lot of fighting. Saul is still not calming down, and Jonathan, even though he defended David, he's not left his dad's side. He's still protecting his dad. In 2 Samuel, unfortunately, David finds out that not only has Saul been killed, which, you know, he didn't want Saul to die, but he wanted the fighting to end, Jonathan has also died. And when he finds out, David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan. And then David sings. He has a lamentation. He sings, "Your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul, anointed with oil no more." Shield of Saul being his son, Jonathan. "From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you with crimson and luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. The term used here for greatly beloved does not appear anywhere else in this book. And as one studier of ancient gay history says, he says my brother Jonathan, not like my brother, not as my brother, which is weird since in other places characters will describe like you are like a brother to me, implying a close familial relationship. They won't claim brotherhood when it's not there. And they are not literal brothers. They're brother-in-laws and they're friends, but they aren't literal brothers. And yet what he says is, my brother, greatly beloved, your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, what I wonder about, what I think about, is one, as we've said, the era of David was before Leviticus 18. At this point, there is no law in the books that says you cannot have homosexual sex. No law in the books that says that. It is not written yet. Another thing, they are in the beginnings of establishing their own nation, in the midst of all these other nations where homosexuality is normal. Egypt, that they just left, is famous for homosexuality. It's everywhere around them. It has to do with the other cults and their religious... So it would be... They would know it. It would be known to them. So why would Saul like David so much and involve David in the family and give him control of the army and then freak out and then decide, I don't trust this guy? What could have changed? Well, Jonathan was in love at first sight, and Jonathan just loves that guy. And why is my son so involved with this guy? Is it not possible that this was a historical instance of homosexuality between two men where possibly the father did not like it? Maybe because it was homosexual, maybe because it was threatening the line of kings and not what Jonathan was supposed to be doing, supposed to be marrying a woman and having children, which is never mentioned in here. I didn't catch a line about marrying someone. After Jonathan and Saul are killed, David takes over the line of kings, even though technically he married into the family. I just find that fascinating that that's, so passionate, passing the love of women. Almost forgot. That was Ruth. I put the note in there so I would remember. Gosh. But that's a picture of Ruth and Naomi when she tries to send Ruth away and Ruth won't go. And that is David and Jonathan saying farewell. They are very famous. Very famous. They have been presented and interpreted as very friendly for a long time. Even more so than Ruth and Naomi, who I think are a bit of a more modern interpretation as far as all that goes. But there's hundreds of years of people writing about, the great love of David and Jonathan. Those, it's just lovely. I love it so much. Especially consider, again, David is so central to Christianity and Judaism. The freaking first, king of Israel united, the ancestor of Jesus. There's just so good. So good. Of course, he goes on to do some other things, but this one particular story is just lovely. And Jonathan and David, are used as examples of passionate loyalty and love between two men, whether or not the person they can intend it platonically or not. I think there is some possible interpretations to be had that maybe it was a historical thing. Maybe it's something, and maybe there was more to it originally that was maybe not written down, maybe taken out, who knows? I think it's entirely fair to see them as us. Either way, they clearly loved each other incredibly. I mean, just, what a story! We'll have to stop there. This one did run a little long. We really couldn't talk about Judaism as deeply as I would want to, as much as I would want to, because there's so much. It's such a long, storied, beautiful history. But for our purposes, discussing what Western tradition about sex is, you really got to start with, you got to go to Christianity. But Christianity was Judaism first. And all the early converts were very Jewish. They brought their Jewish thoughts and feelings with them. They felt they were still Jews for a while after. Like, it wasn't a clean split from the moment Jesus showed up. And so discussing this stuff is really important to understand where Christianity would take it and why. So that was what we will start tomorrow, actually talking about Christians and the way that they will interpret the faith that they came from and what they'll do with it. Thanks for listening. I'm so glad that people seem to be enjoying it. I think from here on out, it'll get a little more bite-sized and not as overwhelming, because trying to cover two really big topics really fast was a lot. But tomorrow we'll start with early Christianity and the Gospel of Mark, if you're interested in opening your Bible and taking a look. If you like what I do and you want to support it, check the links in the description. Links to my second channel, to some of the readings that we did today, to my social media accounts. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I think that's really all I had to say. So thanks again for listening, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.